Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. The website is foreigncountries.podbean.com. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries and you think it's worth $2 a month just to keep it going, please become a patron of the show. Go to patron.podbean.com/foreign countries. The study of magical items has received a great deal of interest in recent years. Whether it's protective phalli on Hadrian's Wall, or charm items, spells or curses, archaeologists have been paying a lot more attention to Apotropaic artefacts in their research. Shortly I'll be joined by Magali Bayot to talk about figurines and curse tablets and Roman attitudes to magic. But first I'm talking to Professor Hella Eckardt of the University of Reading about a particular paper in Britannia called The Sound of Magic. The paper has an emphasis on bells and their apotropaic qualities. Hella, it's a joint paper with Sandie Williams based on her original research.
Okay, so the background to this paper is that my MA student Sandie Williams was looking for a dissertation topic. And what we like to do is to think about objects and what they mean. So our project, we thought we'll look for a group of objects that haven't been studied for some time, and look at them as a group, look at their contexts, look at their association and try and understand what they mean. So that's the kind of artifact work that I think is really important. So artifact studies are not simply sort of stamp collecting. So we do typology and chronology and all those sort of things, and I'll come back to those. But we also think about what the objects may have meant and trying to understand their contexts. And bells are a nice group of objects for that purpose because they have multiple meanings. They're quite common, but they're not so common that it becomes impossible to research them. So there was we recorded about 300 odd from Britain.
It seems remarkable that no substantial work has been done on Roman bells before. How did you go about it?
So quite often with objects, I think there's a temptation that we think, okay, we can identify what its obvious function is, and we can label it, and then we can just describe it as such and sort of park it and put it in an excavation report as just a bell. But sometimes when you look at things as a group, you find out new things. So if you look at all the bells from Roman Britain, and the same goes for many other objects, but in this case bells, if you look at all of them as a group and you try and understand, how they might have been used through time, because obviously the Roman period in Britain, we're looking at 400 years, and across the country, you can find out new things. So the first step always is to make a catalogue. So Sandie started by just going through all the excavation reports, fishing out all the bells that had been published, just as simple one-line entries, bronze bell or whatever, and extracting the other information associated with them. So were they from a grave? Were they from, is it a town? Is it a villa? What is the context date? All of those kind of things. And then we combined that data with the new data that's come from the portable antiquity scheme. So in recent years, there's been this huge boom in finds because metal detectorists in the UK are reporting their finds to the portable antiquity scheme. They entered onto the database, and researchers like Sandie and I can then go on and find information. Now, usually because they metal detected finds, what you don't have is a chronological context, and often you don't really know what the site was. But in the main, those sites are rural sites. So they give a whole new dimension to what was going on with metal objects that we didn't have before, because the excavations have tended to focus on towns, military sites, major villas. And now we have this new data. And that can, throw really new light onto these objects. So if you put all of that together, you can come up with some new ideas.
So the bells came from a lot of different places. How have you organised them, and what new evidence came to light?
Yeah, so the next step for an artifact specialist, I guess, is to group your materials. So if you have 300 odd objects, and we came up with a number of types. So you can have ones that have little feet, you can look at the overall shape of them, the shape of the handles, and you can group your bells into those different types. And one thing we found that was really odd was there was one type for which we had no parallels really in Britain. They were all from the PAS, and they had these strange triangular cutouts. So they have a geometric design with opposing triangles on the body of the bell, which is really odd because it must have changed the sound of the bell. It seems to be a counterintuitive thing to do with bells. But anyway, so there was this group of them for which we couldn't find very many parallels. So once you've done your typology, you can then go through all the ones from excavations first and see if there's any context date attached. And that in that way, we can say, okay, this might be an early type, this might be a late type. And then you can also look at their individual distributions and say, well, where do they occur? How widespread are they? Those kind of things. Now, with most of our bells, that showed that, they occur across most of Britain, and there were some chronological differences, but not huge ones. But with the open work bells, we were really stuck because what happened was really they were all from the PAS, so we had no context date at all. And when we looked at their distribution, we thought it's really strange because they are in the southeast of Britain across a wide range of sites, but none from excavations at all. And at first we thought they may be related to so-called Norse bells. So these are medieval bells that occur further north in Britain. They have a sort of stamp design usually, so they're not really that similar. So we mapped them, we looked at a map of them and compared them to ours, and they really have a different distribution. So we started to think, well, maybe they're Roman. And then what we thought we'd do, okay, is we'll look on the continent, we'll look at the rest of the empire to see if we can find parallels. Now, for all our usual bell types, you find parallels across France, Germany, Holland, even Italy, wherever you might look in the empire. But these open work ones, they just simply don't occur anywhere else. So we couldn't find them in any of the published reports until we started to look at, so I started to read some of the literature in sort of more Central Eastern Europe, and we realized that there are bells that are virtually identical from the Black Sea region. So around the northern part of the Black Sea, there is a whole group of these bells that occur in burials of the 1st and 2nd century.
So do you have any explanation for this?
To be honest, we don't. So, it is possible that there was some kind of troop movement between these two areas, and that explains it. That people were moved and they had these particular types of bells. But other than that, I have no explanation for this, quite striking parallel. I think this is one of those cases where we have to wait until we find more. So if we do find a few more from excavated contexts, then I think we can start to think more about what they mean and what's going on.
So thinking beyond the functional properties of the bells, what do we know about their roles and their uses?
Yeah, so if we want to start thinking about the symbolic meaning of the bells, so some of the bells are clearly animal bells. So you get huge, great big ones, iron ones. We know from the written sources that there were things like market bells and bells that were rung when people went to the bath. But then the smaller bells, the written sources seem to indicate that they may have magical properties. So you get these accounts of bells in doorways, you get them hanging from figurines, sometimes these huge phallic figurines in Pompeii, multiple bells hanging from them. And as the wind, it's a wind chime, and it's meant to avert evil spirits. So we knew that from the written sources, but obviously Britain is a very different province. So, the written sources are all about Italy, and the elite really, what is going on in Britain. So the way to find out is to look at the context systematically. So what we did is we looked at all the examples that we could find from temples, for example, and from burials. The temple evidence wasn't very clear cut, so we found a few on temple sites, but not necessarily in an overtly ritual context, if you see what I mean. But in the burials, we can actually check who is found with a bell. And it tended to be children and women, so especially children. And I think what that indicates is that, and we know this from the written sources, that they may have had a bell tied around their wrist, for example, or their neck, and the ringing of it was meant to protect the child. Obviously, in the cases where they found in burials, it hasn't worked, but that's where we're finding them. So we can record that information, and that seemed to be quite a clear pattern in Britain, that they were not that they were in particular kinds of burials, and sometimes those burials had other objects in them that looked like amulets or apotropaic objects. So they might have pierced coins, or they might have phallic amulet, or things like that, or a boar tooth, or things like that.
And what about protection in the next life? Is that likely?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it could be both, couldn't it? We can't tell whether the child was wearing the bell in life or just in death, or both. But yeah, absolutely. I think that dimension is there. Those tend to be small bells, so little small domed bells that you could easily wear, but that would still make quite a distinctive sound if you shook them or if you moved.
So what do we know about the context in which these possibly protective bells are found?
So amongst the graves, if we want to look at some specific examples, it's quite interesting because we can go back and we can look at those graves, and we don't always have aging and sexing information from the human remains. Sometimes it's other finds that suggest that it's the grave of a female or a child. So, for example, in Colchester, we have a couple of graves. So one was the grave of a girl. She was only 10 years old, and she had an armlet on which there was a bell. There's another one also from Colchester where there's a whole group of amuletic objects. So there was the bell, obviously, then there was an amber pendant in the form of a head, a small horned phallus, and two pierced coins. And these, so that's a later Roman burial, sort of early 4th century. We didn't actually have any human remains, but the size of the grave cut suggests that it was a child. Another one where it's worn on the wrist. So we seem to be getting a sort of expectation that it's usually children. Sometimes it's women. In Winchester, we have a woman buried with a child, but we don't know which person, the bell was for. And so, yeah, we can dig into that information. And even if the human remains are not always preserved, sometimes the other grave goods tell us that it was a woman or a child.
Right. We have a whole new catalogue now, but what needs to happen in the future with these kinds of artefacts?
Yeah, I think in terms of future research, I mean, there's the question with those strange bells with the triangles, what are they for and where are they from? So it'd be really nice if more of those are found and people look at them. There may have been some on the continent that we've missed. That's always possible. I think in general, the future is really about these kind of artifact studies and doing it with multiple objects, trying to really understand how suites of objects are used. You could do a similar study with little phallic amulets. You could look at the pierced coins, or whether coins, one of the things we thought about when we wrote the paper was whether the coins in these particular graves have meaning. Is there something on the coin or the coin reverse that has particular meaning? Nina Crummy wrote a very interesting burial on tiny little jet bear figurines that are found in children's graves, and she's arguing that the coins found with them perhaps were selected to signify something. So I think there are lots of interesting projects that people can take forward from this.
Yeah, but the problem is that these bells were found by metal detectorists without a context. So how can you actually build on that?
Yeah, the other thing that's really wonderful about Roman archaeology, I think, is that we have an understanding of context. So we can say, even if the immediate context is lost, so, it might be a pit or a floor surface or a ditch. If we know the type of site something comes from, we can say something about the cultural milieu in which they are found and the kinds of people who were likely to have used it. And I think that can be quite powerful. So some objects can be very strongly associated, for example, with the Roman army. Previous work that I've done on lighting equipment, on lamps, they just overwhelmingly associated with the army and with large towns like Colchester or London. But other types of objects may have an association with rural population, for example, or particular types of rural sites. So there's a recent project also at the University of Reading called the Roman Rural Settlement Project. And they looked at finds and all the data from rural sites across Britain. And you can see that different types of objects occur on different types of rural sites. So if you take context seriously and record it in a systematic way, you can come up with new patterns and a better understanding of the kinds of things people were doing with these objects.
So a more synthetic understanding of magical items in Britain is what comes next. Thank you, Hella. I'm going to turn to the continent now and broaden this out with Magali. Dr. Magali Bayot has published several articles on magical items and the concept of magic in the Roman world. And she joins me now to talk about curse tablets, wax figurines and the Roman law that governed them. Now, my command of French is schoolboy at best, so I was very relieved when Magali agreed to talk to me in English. Magali, we're going to talk about your Britannia paper on wax figurines used in magical ritual. But before that, can you tell me something about your previous work and how it led to your more recent study of the archaeological evidence for magic?
Before writing this paper, I was studying Greco-Roman magic through archaeological evidence, especially curse tablets. Those tablets were personal prayers of individuals inscribed on small pieces of lead or other material. With amulets, gemstones, they are one of the most important epigraphical and archaeological sources on magic. They were used to bound a victim to the desires of a practitioner and to ensure victory in competition, for example, races or games. They were supposed to ensure victory in a legal dispute or to ensure victory in love intrigues. Sometimes they were written to seek revenge for theft. In Latin, those tablets were called defixiones, from the verb defigere, which means I nailed on or I transfix. The important thing I knew is that those inscriptions used to be submitted to deities and that they were included in a ritual. So studying ritual from archaeological evidence seemed relevant to me and pretty new so far as I knew at the time.
Okay, so your Britannia paper made a survey of wax figurines all across the Roman West. What was the context of these artefacts? Where were they found?
So at the beginning, I made an inventory of tablets from the Roman Western provinces and then associated evidence. The survey was the first step to understand how the curse ritual was performed. The archaeological evidence studied in a large scope were the tablets themselves. Tablets, for example, were sometimes rolled up or pierced by nails. The place of deposition was important too. The tablets were hidden in a place that allowed contact with the chthonic deities, places such as temples, but also pipes of baths, etc. They were often buried in a grave with the soul of a dead person. So we have a lot of objects and finds which help us to understand the ritual. And of course, we have the figurines. Magic figurines depict the victims of the ritual and were generally a few centimeters tall and fashioned from wax, lead, and clay. Several features indicate their function, features such as nailing, burning, binding, and twisting. Their limbs were often bound or twisted and could be pierced by nail or needles. Archaeological context and comparisons with identified Mediterranean figurines and descriptions given by the Greek magical papyri were also the key for the interpretation. So this paper focused on the Western provinces and had set out to complement a major study and inventory of Greek, Etruscan, and Roman magic figurine published in 1991 by the Professor Christopher Faraone. Basically, the survey of magic figurine reflects the result of recent archaeological excavation carried out in Europe. It shows that complex rituals, including figurines, were also performed in the Latin West. They were not specific to the Mediterranean basin as we thought earlier. Italy, Germany, Austria, Britain, and France have yielded at least 24 figurines. This inventory has revealed that magic figurines come often from important places, such as villa or provincial capitals, with inscriptions themselves. They also underline that magic was performed at all levels of society and not only in the most marginal groups. Private locations such as a cellar, a grave, and a temple show a strong connection with chthonic deities.
So the figurines could be bound, pierced, generally abused as some sort of proxy for what? For the intended victim?
Oh yes. For example, in the city of Reims in France, we have found a figurine and it was enclosed in a clay pot with a key. it was the evidence showed that it had been pierced by nails, and it was made with clay. And we found next to it some charcoal, so we thought that some sacrifices have been made. And in another place in France, we found another figurine, and it was made with lead, and all the legs were bound. In Britain, there is a figurine with bound legs as well, which has been found in a pit in Fishbourne. It's a very big villa in England. A long time ago, archaeologists found a lead figurine in Morocco. They came from a pipe. Probably people threw the figurine in the water in order to put them underground. And this is very important for the ritual. Burying, hiding the objects were the final gesture during the ritual.
Was there one that was tortured?
Yeah, in Austria, archaeologists found just the head of a clay figurine, and it seems that figurine has been really badly tortured. They found traces, needles in the neck or on the face of the figurine. And the figurines we have in France or in Austria or in Britain are very similar to the dolls found in Egypt and in Greece. And more recently in Italy, in Rome, many figurines have been recovered in a temple, and they show the same specificities on the body. Sometimes you can see that they have been pierced by nails, sometimes the legs or the arms are bound, and sometimes there are figurines on their body show inscriptions, magical inscriptions. We don't have this kind of thing in France, but in Italy, the figurines show inscription on their body. Sometimes they were also put in a box or in a clay pot with the inscription and then buried. These kind of things appear everywhere in Europe with more or less details. In Germany, they also found figurines in a temple, in a pit with a lot of different kind of offerings. Sometimes the offering seems to be linked to a normal, in bracket, a normal cult, but sometimes they were really linked to magic. The archaeologists found tablets with charcoal, with bones, and the figurines were partially burnt. So this is another example of how the figurine could be treated. So binding, twisting, fire are quite common use during the ritual.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that these figurines were being used in ritual behaviour. So how do you interpret those rituals?
Well, even though the figurines were violently manipulated and the inscriptions could be really tough, the defixture ritual was first of all technical and performative. By performative, I mean rituals as sentences which create a situation by virtue of just being said. For example, we can say that the wedding formula, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," creates the legal union. So for the ritual during the antiquity, the logic was the same. The words used during the ritual, the manipulation of the figurine are performative like that. So this ritual was based on a belief in the power of specific words and was designed to restrain and inhibit the victims. Spells were linked to the gestures or wished for state of the victims. The aim of the ritual was to bind or nail them down. The ritual was performed to render victims unable to resist. Victims were to be weakened in the same way as the figurines were tortured. Also, we have observed that the gestures represented on the figurines depended on the aims of the curse. In some love spells, for example, torture with fire was supposed to cause the victims to burn with passion. So the torture is not something made during violent moments, They are really technical and answer to a precise question or issue.
I think these figurines are still rather rare, aren't they? So where can research go in the future?
It's quite exceptional to find figurines. They are not so common. If we, considering all the excavation carried out in France, we don't have so much figurines. But I realized that in museum we have a lot of tablets and we can do things about them. I'm in the sense of sometimes figurines were replaced by drawings directly engraved on the tablets. And I guess my wish is to study those evidence from a large inventory. It would be interesting to study recent recovered artifacts and artifacts which now in museum for a very long time. So create an inventory of drawings on tablets would be very interesting because we could make comparison between figurines and drawings.
And following on from that, you have published a chapter in a new book, which is called A Guide to Magic in the Ancient World. Is that more about understanding the concept of magic in the Roman mind?
The most important thing I was focusing on for this contribution is the evolution of the concept of magic during the Roman period, especially from the legal point of view. And the legal point of view was really linked to the power, the emperor and the most important person in the society. So the legal point of view is a point of view of the elite, while people were practicing magic or believing in it, in supernatural things. The Roman elites try to organize the things. For example, they do not say it doesn't exist. They just try to put a distance between them and this strange thing called magic. They found a legal solution to something which was a cause to disorders. For example, some people were accused to steal things. With their magical power, people thought they were able to steal goods of the neighbors. And the result was things disappeared, and people said that's magic. And the elite didn't say it's wrong or false. They just tried to answer, say, well, some people stole your goods, so we're going to find a legal solution, punishments, but not for magic, just because for a pragmatic.
Right, so magic did exist, but it was only practiced by criminals. They were the real problem.
The answer was pragmatic.
It was indeed. Thank you very much, Magali Bayo. You can follow up on all these publications on the Foreign Countries website. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.